Have you wondered at all, as we are now a year plus into COVID reality and we're now coming out of it, have you wondered at all what trauma is doing to us? Have you wondered, how is this affecting me? Or maybe have you wondered, how is this affecting my children? They have been at home by themselves with only their siblings for the past year. I think the reality is the whole world has experienced something that somehow intuitively we know that we are going to be changed by this. We are going through a trauma of sorts. But today I want to talk about, do we have to be traumatized because we have gone through a trauma? So often we experience trauma and we know this, right? That it traumatizes us. I remember when I was 15 or 16 years old, I was with a group of friends, my sister and my older sister and her friends. We were all in a minivan going to go play hide and go seek in a cemetery at night. Who does that? Teenagers do crazy things. So we were going out, it was late in the evening, and I was sitting in the very back row of a full minivan of teenagers. And we pulled out of my friend's driveway and we backed up. And as soon as we backed up, I saw coming around a corner a speeding car that was coming at us. And I realized quickly that it was not going to stop. Turns out the driver was intoxicated, and so we got hit. And I think there was something for me about seeing it happening. It was like it happens in movies, right? Where time slows down. It went into slow motion, and I see that we're about to get hit, and then it comes and it gets hit. I have a little scar on my elbow still. I was okay. But what happened to me afterwards was every time I was in the back seat of a car, my mom would be driving, and I found myself flinching. Like that traumatic experience changed something in my brain, changed something on the inside of me that took me a while to be able to drive in the backseat of a car without flinching again. Or how about this? So the Smith family got a puppy. And yes, you knew it was coming up. If you know, we got a puppy and we are so excited. He's a cute little, tiny little guy. His name is Louie. And we are having to eat so much humble pie because we have now been proven wrong, because Judah and I said we would never have a dog. In fact, Grace used to ask, can I get a dog? And I'd say, well, if God tells me to, but probably not. Well, apparently God told us to. I don't know. We didn't hear a voice from heaven, but we've got a dog. And so we are making preparations and waiting for this dog to come home. So the first place we go is the pet store, as you do, to get food and all the necessities. And the person at the pet store told us, now you make sure with your dog that you leave some time where he can be by himself, because we're noticing so many pets right now have separation anxiety because they have been with their owners 24/7 for the last 14 months. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. So we take Louie, our little guy, to the vet. And as I'm on the phone with the vet, the dog's inside, keeping social distancing practices at the veterinarian. And the vet told me, now you got to make sure that you leave him some time where he is by himself, because our dogs are getting separation anxiety. And I just started laughing. I thought, oh my goodness, these last 14 months have affected dogs, let alone humans. I know a few months after intense quarantine last summer, I saw somebody in person for the first time who wasn't my immediate family. And I was talking to her, and finally about 20 minutes into the conversation, I just had to apologize and say, I am so sorry. I am socially out of shape. I'm stuttering. I forgot how to ask questions. This has changed me. And of course, those are small examples, but the reality is it's been a significant trauma to our world. Maybe you've lost somebody who you've loved throughout this traumatic event. Maybe you lost a job. There has been a lot of loss and trauma for the last 14 months. And so what I want to talk about today is, do we have to be traumatized even though we have experienced something traumatic? And we're going to look at two stories in the Bible of individuals who went through trauma, but as we can see, weren't traumatized. And we're going to find the common thread between those two stories so that we can really go about this next transition as we move out of COVID with faith and with belief and with excitement, knowing that we have experienced this trauma, but we don't have to be traumatized. So the first story we are going to look at is at the Apostle Paul. And we're reading his story, just snippets of it throughout the book of Acts. The scriptures will come on the screen. I'll just tell you about it. But the Apostle Paul was a man who, throughout his entire ministry, he got beaten, he was stoned, he was ridiculed, and he experienced this over and over at the beginning of his ministry. And every time at the beginning of his ministry that he experienced beatings or persecution or floggings, he would go back into the city, he would get back up. It's like he had this tenacity to him that this traumatic events weren't going to stop him from doing what God called him to do. But something really interesting happens as we get to Acts chapter 16. So this is the story where Paul was ministering in the town of Philippi. And here he was in the town of Philippi, and all of a sudden the mob came against him and they went to persecute him. And listen to what happened. People started getting agitated and frustrated at Paul. And in Acts chapter 16, verse 22, it says that the crowd joined in the attack against Paul and Silas. And the magistrates ordered that they would be stripped and beaten with rods. And after they had been severely flogged, it says, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. So here something happens. Now, Paul had been beaten many times over, and I don't know what was different about this particular beating or this particular flogging. But it actually triggered something within Paul, because after that, his MO changes. He started doing things differently after he had been beaten and flogged. And what I find was so interesting is even here in verse 25, when Paul was in the Philippian jail, it says that he and Silas were praying and singing hymns. And so it's like from a spiritual perspective, he did everything right? He experienced this traumatic event, and then he did all the things he was supposed to do. He prayed, he worshiped, he evangelized to the Philippian jailer. He did all of the things right. But somehow something on the inside of him still triggered, and he changed. And how do we know he changed? Look what happens in Acts chapter 17. So here is Paul in Acts chapter 17 in Thessalonica. And here he is, and the mob starts coming at him again. And as the mob is coming at him again, instead of going and defending himself, actually somebody else has to go before the magistrates. But listen to what happened. In verse 9, it says, they made Jason, who was the other person who had to go before trial, they made Jason and the others post bond and let them go. But listen to what happened to Paul. As soon as it was night, the believers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. And on arriving there, they went to the Jewish synagogue. So instead of Paul's normal mode of operations, which is after he got beat, he still went back into a city. And even if he had to leave, he would hug everybody and make sure he said a proper goodbye. No, at this point, he sneaks out in the middle of the night to go to Berea. So what happens when he gets to Berea? Listen to this. While he's in Berea, verse 13, just a few verses later, it says this: when the Jews in Thessalonica learned that Paul was preaching the word of God at Berea, some of them went up there too and started agitating the crowds and stirring them up against Paul. And so Paul is worrying, oh no, is there going to be a riot? Am I going to get beaten again? Is there going to be a mob come at me again? And listen to what happens. It says that the believers immediately sent Paul up the coast, but Paul and Timothy stayed at Berea. Once again, Paul just slipped out to avoid getting beat. And then a third time, he is preaching once again in chapter 17. Paul is in Athens, and the mob starts getting agitated once again. And it says there that Paul just left the meeting, and we don't know what happens to him after that. So 3 times in a row, Paul just ducks out, leaves early, doesn't want to stay. And so often, I know Judah touched on this a couple weeks ago, we think that these characters in the Bible are like superheroes, non-human, don't have regular emotions, aren't like me and you. These are just these like elite Christians. But the reality is that Paul is just like you, and he's just like me. He went through a traumatic event, a traumatic experience, and something changed on the inside of him. Something shifted on the inside, and his mode changed, and he didn't stay when there was a threat of being beaten. I have to say, I do not blame him one teeny tiny bit. I'm impressed he stuck around for as often as he did to get beat time after time after time early on in his ministry, right? But he was human just like me and you. And I think there was something about this beating that happened to him and this beating in Philippi that just triggered something in him. And he's just like, I don't want to go through that again. Have you found yourself in that place? Feeling, I don't want to go through that again. Maybe you've gone through breakup after breakup after breakup, and you've just decided, I'm not going to go through that again. Maybe you took a risk in business, and not only once, but you did it twice, and your business let you down, and you feel like, I don't want it to let me down again, so I'm just going to stop. I don't want to go through that again. Or maybe even what's happening in the world right now and so much of the chaos in the world around us. And you read a news story or you hear a story, a report from a friend, and you wonder, is this going to happen again? I don't want to go through that again. That is a normal human reaction and response that even the incredible Apostle Paul felt when he went through trauma. But do you know what I think is so amazing? That is not the end of Paul's story. Acts chapter 17, when he slipped out of Athens, isn't the end of his journey. From there, he went into a town called Corinth. And he was there and listened to what happened there that changed everything for Paul. This changed everything for him. In Acts chapter 18, in verse 9, Paul is once again in the city of Corinth. He fell asleep, or we don't know what happened to him, but listen to what his experience was. It says, one night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision and said, don't be afraid. Keep on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you. And no harm will come to you because I have many people in this city. So verse 11, it says that Paul stayed in Corinth for a year and a half, teaching them the word of God. Paul went through a traumatic experience. Something happened on the inside of him. He changed. And then he had an encounter with Jesus. In fact, it's not in this Bible, but in so many Bibles, these words are actually in red. Scholars believe this was actually Jesus who came and spoke to Paul. And he said, don't be afraid. I am with you. And it was that one encounter with Jesus that went from him experiencing trauma and being traumatized to being healed and then going on and doing what God called him to do. In fact, after this, Paul never said no to being persecuted. He actually said yes to going on to Jerusalem, even though he knew persecution and beatings were going to await him there. Something so significant happened to him when he encountered Jesus that trauma was healed and he got to go forward and do what God called him to do. You know, so often I think in the church, we get the reputation as Christians and church people of people who are outside of the church looking in and they think, I don't know if I can ever relate to those people in the church. They just seem to have it all put together. They couldn't actually relate to what I'm going through. And sometimes it's because church people can put on a happy face and not really reveal what's going on in the inside. And so I'm not a proponent of that. But sometimes I think we have so much peace and so much joy, and we have received so much healing because we've encountered Jesus that maybe you can't even tell that we have gone through some of the trauma that we have gone through as Christians. I'll never forget when Judah and I were youth pastors, we had two amazing girls who were in our youth ministry. They were probably middle school and high school at the time where I had my firstborn son, Zion. Actually, we had them. Judah was involved, go figure. And we had our son and this new little baby. He was born 6 weeks premature, so he was tiny. And I don't know if every new mom goes through this, but I definitely had a feeling of what if something happens to my son? I don't think I could go on. I don't think I could get out of bed. And you read these articles about SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, and it's just like this paralyzing fear that would grip me or want me to just protect him and not let him go. And right around that time, I heard the story of the family of these two girls. and found out that their mom actually lost a baby to SIDS when this baby was a few months old. And I remember hearing that story, being so shocked and so surprised, not because I knew that bad things don't happen to incredible Jesus following people, but because I looked at this family with these two incredible girls, and I never would have known that they went through this trauma. I never would have been able to tell that this was the mother of somebody who had lost an infant baby. What happened to this family that they had such a great level of healing that I was so surprised when I heard that they went through that trauma? I believe it was Jesus. And just like Paul, they had an encounter with Jesus where Jesus said, "You don't have to be afraid. I am with you." In fact, there was another lady in church. She was like the kind, sweet, mid-60s church lady that you could find in the doors of every church throughout the world. There is just that sweet old lady who you think, not old, 60s isn't old, we're almost getting there, so it's not old, sweet middle-aged lady. And she was just like beaming radiance of kindness and love and compassion. I'm sure some people met her and would have thought to themselves, she could never really understand what I'm going through. Here is this lady who has it all together. So one year for Mother's Day, a few years ago, hint, hint, it is Mother's Day next week, by the way. So if you haven't gotten anything, you can write that on your calendar and make sure you do something, babe. He's in the room. So it was Mother's Day. And so I decided to interview this incredible woman and have her tell her story. And as she told her story of being horrifically sexually abused throughout her childhood that really left her in a place of horrific insecurities and addiction to every kind of drug that you can even imagine. And she found herself on her bathroom one morning and just crying out to just like, "God, if you're really there, I don't know what to do." And the way she tells the story, her face was dirty, her hair was matted just because she had been living in drugs and addiction. And in a moment, Jesus appeared to her. And he appeared to her and she realized that he was real. And she said she walked out of that bathroom. It was miraculous. Her face was clean. Her hair was untangled. She walked down to the church down the street. It just happened to be a Sunday morning. And she got to know Jesus in a real and personal way. And now here she was 40 years later. And you never would have known the trauma that she had gone through based on who she was. It is possible for us to go through trauma and not be traumatized. The key to that is encountering Jesus, is letting Jesus in, letting him see your trauma, letting him know what hurts, letting him know what's really going on. You know what I love about Jesus in this encounter he had with Paul? He knew what to say to him. He said, "Don't be afraid." He could have said, "I love you." He could have said, "I have great things in store for you." He could have said all of these things, but what he said cut to the very heart of what Paul was experiencing, and that was fear based on trauma. So Jesus came to him and said, "Don't be afraid. I am with you." What do you need to hear from Jesus today? What do you need to hear from him that is going to give you a peace, that's going to give you reassurance? Do you need to hear your kids are going to be okay? Do you need to hear you're not a failure? Do you need to hear you're enough? Do you need to hear that God has it in control? I don't know what you need to hear, but do you know who does? Jesus. And the Spirit of Jesus, what makes him so amazing is that he is everywhere at the same time. And so he is right there with you. And the very room that you are in, listening to this message, he is with you. And he wants to whisper in your ear. He wants to tell you exactly what you need to hear in this moment to have faith that you will not be traumatized, that you will be okay. I told you we were going to look at two stories. The final story we're going to go to is the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's an Old Testament story. It's in the book of Daniel. It's one of those really good ones. You know, the one that you hear when you're in Sunday school, if you grew up going to Sunday school, because it's just one of those like, God is so awesome in this story, and the good guys win and the bad guys realize that God is God, and it's just an awesome story. So there's these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they are Jewish men. They consider themselves Hebrews, and this is during the time of the Babylonian captivity. So even though they were Jewish men, they were under the oppression of Babylon and King Nebuchadnezzar. And so here's this king. He made a decree. He said, anybody who won't bow down to my false idols is going to get thrown in the furnace. Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had a covenant with God that they knew they were going to serve the one true God. So they had a commitment not to bow down to idols. And so they refused. When King Nebuchadnezzar heard that these three young men refused to bow down to the idol, he got so mad. He said, we're going to throw them in the furnace, and we are going to heat the furnace 7 times hotter than normal. This wasn't just a regular fire he was going to put them in. He was going to put them in an extreme fire. Let's go to the book of Daniel and see what happens. Maybe you've read this story before, maybe you haven't, but let's think about it in the context of trauma, of going through a fiery trial, of going through something hard, and what is going to happen to us. Listen to this in Daniel chapter 3. And the king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In other words, when these soldiers who had them bound tried to throw them in the furnace, the soldiers got burnt. As the story goes on in verse 25, this is King Nebuchadnezzar. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, and they are unbound and unharmed. And the 4th looks like the sons of the gods. We're going to go on with this story in just a second, but can I make a note here? These men got thrown into the fire, and look at what got burned when they were in the fire. The men who were holding them captive got burned. The ropes that were binding them got burned. Do you know what I believe for you and for me in this season of trauma that we are in together as a world? That the fire that tried to kill us, the fire and this trauma that has tried to annihilate us, instead of burning us and consuming us, it will burn the things that are holding us captive. Do you have things that you feel like are holding you captive? Things that you feel like you can't get rid of? Things that are holding you back? Maybe you don't even know what they are, but God knows. God knows the future He has for you. He knows what He has in store for you. And do you know what He wants for you? He wants you to not be burned. He wants to burn up those things that are holding you captive. Did God make this fire happen in these men's life? Absolutely not. But did He turn it around and use it for their good, just like Romans 8:28 tells us He will do? We know that all things work together for good for those who love God and those are called according to His purpose? Absolutely. He put them in a fire that didn't burn them, but it burned the things that chained them and held them back. Can you believe for that for your own life? Can you believe for that for you? This is what happened to me when I was 29 and 30, and Judah and I were taking over the church. And it was probably the first real trauma that I had been through. Judah's dad was dying of cancer, and we were watching his body change literally week by week and month by month. And we were taking over the church, and it was difficult. And people who I thought loved us and were going to be with us forever didn't like the decisions we were making, so they were leaving, and it just felt like traumatic. And I felt so over my head anyway. And, you know, when your husband's going through grief and you're feeling insecure, guess what happens? You fight. So Judah and I were fighting, and we had 3 young kids at the time. And I feel so blessed that was really the first trauma I went through. But it was that, and it was real. And this verse was the verse that was life to me during that season. It says this of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Verse 27, it says that the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, and the royal advisors, basically all the people of influence, they crowded around and they looked at them. And it says that they saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their head singed, and their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. They walked through the fire, and all the fire did was burn away their captivity. but they didn't even smell like smoke. Can you believe that? Have you ever been around a fire? That smell of smoke is permeating. It gets around you when you are 10, 15, 20 feet away. But here are these men who were in this intense fire and were not burned. Their hair wasn't singed, and they didn't even smell like smoke. How is that possible? Sure, it's a miracle. And yes, that was a wonderful God intervention on their behalf. But do you know that God still wants to intervene on your behalf? It's possible because of the fourth man who was in the fire. What did King Nebuchadnezzar say? It says he looked into the fire and he saw four men unharmed and unbound. And he said, and the fourth man looks like a son of God. Scholars all believe this was a Christophany. This was an early appearance of Jesus on the planet even before he was born. And because Jesus was in the fire with them, they were not burned, and not even the smell of smoke was on them. What we're going through right now, I have so much faith, and maybe your faith isn't there. You can borrow some of my faith in this moment. I have so much faith for us that we will walk out of this, and the only thing that will have been burned are the things that held us captive. We won't be traumatized. We won't say, nope, I'm not going to do it again like Paul did. We are going to come out of this stronger and with a closer relationship with Jesus, because Jesus has been in the fire with us. As we look at these two stories between Paul and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they went through a very different process. Paul's was long. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's was instantaneous. But there is one thing that they both have in common, and that is that Jesus was with them. And can I tell you, church, right now, Jesus is with you. And you can walk through this trauma that our world is walking through and your own personal circumstances that you are walking through. And you can go through it and not be traumatized. Can I pray for you? Jesus, we thank you that you are the one who walks into fire with us. We thank you that you are the one who appears to us when we're living out trauma and having a hesitation to not want to go experience that thing again. Jesus, I know that you are the same God who appeared to Paul, who appeared to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Jesus, I pray for every person listening that you would appear before them, that you would be the unique God that you are to every individual, that you would know exactly how to come and how to speak and how to walk us through this fire. I thank you that you are the same yesterday, today, and forever, but you are unique to each and every one of us to appear to us the way that we need you. We thank you, Jesus, that because of who you are, we can walk through fire and not be burned. We're so grateful for you, Jesus. Thank you, Lord. Now, if you just want to keep your eyes closed for one more minute, I just want to pray one last prayer. And that is, if you're watching today and you want to get to know Jesus, you want to receive him and his forgiveness. Maybe he's always felt like a mythical character to you or a historical figure. Can I tell you, he is God. He loves you. He is for you. He is with you. And he wants to forgive you. He wants to show you his love. And if you just say wherever you are, I want to know Jesus in a personal and authentic way. Wherever you are, just slip up your hand, or maybe with your own words, just say, Jesus, I want to know you. Just a simple prayer. And I believe that Jesus is going to reveal himself to you in such a real way. Church, we love you. God bless.